Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Nick and this is On Buddhism, a series of short introductory video lectures on topics of Buddhism. Today we're going to pick up a little bit more with the development of Buddhism in the Buddha's life, and we're going to talk about the different schools of Buddhism that are starting to develop among the disciples of the Buddha. The Buddha is saying what the Buddha is saying, and that's written in the Sutras, and we can read that. These are recorded by his disciples and whatnot, but in an interpretive sense, the words are his words, and the disciples are going to go off and do what they're going to do with his words. So what they're starting to do is actually starting to interpret the Dharma and interpret these sermons that the Buddha is giving in their own philosophical way. And what ends up being the case is we see the development of several different early schools of Buddhism. There's a bunch of different schools that emphasize different parts of the sutras, different parts of the Dharma, and emphasize that in their practice. These are called the Nikaya schools. These are the early schools that start basically with the material that we have in this class so far. The Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, 10 Good Deeds, 3 Jewels, and some other lists that we haven't gone over yet. These schools will eventually live and die and come back and change and morph and mold and merge with each other into essentially 3 schools of Buddhism. So there's 3 modern big schools of Buddhism that each have their own different sects and each have their own different interpretations of Buddhism. The earliest one that we can talk about is Theravada. Theravada Buddhism is the school of Buddhism that emphasizes monastic life and the path of the Arhat. An Arhat is a Buddhist monk. A Buddhist monk follows the 5 precepts that we talked about in the last video, in addition to 5 other precepts. These precepts include no taking money and handling money, no eating after noon, and other things. No putting on perfumes, no putting on colorful clothing. They must sleep in a certain kind of bed, etc. They follow the precepts very strictly, and they're not permitted to deviate from them in any way. They must survive only off of alms. They can't buy or sell food on their own, and they can grow food, but they live off the generosity of the community. They also worship relics, very specifically. These relics are called sarira, or sharira, and they'll be put into a stupa. These include bones of the Buddha. These include clothes that the Buddha wore, or things that the Buddha touched or that he had. These also include sutras and other important relics, similar to relics in Catholicism. One of the funny stories I got told in college is that the Buddha had as many teeth as an adult man has, and each one of these teeth is a relic. However, there are 40 different schools and 40 different sutras that claim to have a tooth of the Buddha. So if you do the math, some of them are lying. Some of them do not actually have the teeth of the Buddha because he had the normal amount of teeth that a human adult man has. So that's kind of funny how they do that. But they worship the relics, and these schools are dominant in India and Southeast Asia. Theravada is probably one of the less populated schools of Buddhism, and it doesn't have as many sects as other schools of Buddhism, but it's very popular, and it's the one that people practice in India and in Southeast Asia. The other school that we can talk about is Mahayana. Mahayana emphasizes Buddhism for the lay person, for the householder, for someone who has bills and responsibility and grief and families and sadness and hunger and material possessions. This Buddhism emphasizes the Bodhisattva path. As we've talked about before, or may not have talked about, the Bodhisattva path is the path to become a Buddha who has decided to put off their own enlightenment, their own disappearance from the cycle of samsara, from birth and death, to stay behind and ensure and secure the enlightenment and salvation of all sentient beings. So they become teachers, they become spiritual leaders, community leaders, and they become educators. The Bodhisattva path is highly, highly emphasized and is very important in Mahayana Buddhism. They also have more relaxed interpretations of the precepts. This is because they don't live as monks. They live in regular life. One of the precepts that was the first to go away is the precept saying that you cannot handle money. A householder has to handle money every day. That's just simply the fact of living in the real world. And so handling money as a precept went away. There's also some more relaxed interpretations of the original 5 precepts that we talked about before. These include, for example, sexual misconduct. The Theravada Buddhists interpret this as living celibate, having no sex in their entire life, never taking a spouse, etc. Mahayana Buddhists focus this more on not engaging in indulgent sex, criminal sex, violent sex, etc. So it's a more relaxed interpretation of that precept. They create more sutras than any other school of Buddhism over history. So most sutras that you read, including the Lotus Sutra, the Parinirvana Sutra, the Deer Park Sutra, etc., these all are Mahayana Buddhist sutras, and they're created by Mahayana Buddhists for the Mahayana schools. They also worship these texts very closely. So whereas in a Theravada stupa, you might walk in and see a bone or a shirt or a cup being worshipped, you'll walk into a Mahayana temple and at the center of it, there'll actually be a scroll where someone has written the Lotus Sutra or where they have written the Heart Sutra or something like that. This is the Buddhism that is most dominant and has the most different schools and sects in it in East Asia. So in Korea, Japan, and China, they are mainly Mahayana Buddhists. There's a third school that comes to develop and is a much smaller school, but is actually very well known in the West. This is Vajrayana Buddhism. Most people know this as Tibetan Buddhism. This focuses around Buddhist tantras or special texts, Buddhist mantras, special chants, Buddhist mudras, special hand positions, and mandalas, sand art that they create. If you've seen the mandalas before, they're very beautiful, and they're made out of sand, and they're very symmetrical, and they depict different myths, and they're made out of sand to remind the creator of the impermanence of all things. At the end of the creation of a mandala, they will actually blow the sand away that they've poured very carefully and very specifically, very precisely. And this is dominant in Tibet and in Mongolia. So it has fewer practitioners, but Vajrayana is also the kind of Buddhism that has the ecumenical structure which contains the Dalai Lama and the Rinpoches. The Dalai Lama is the spiritual leader of Vajrayana Buddhism, but Mahayana and Theravada Buddhists do not recognize him as a spiritual leader. They recognize him as a very smart, very wise, very loving, very good Buddhist, but they don't recognize him as their own authoritative leader. This is something that not a lot of people realize. The vast majority of Buddhists do not recognize the authority of the Dalai Lama over their own school of Buddhism. This is similar to how Protestants respect the Pope and the things the Pope says, and they admire the Pope for being such a godly man, but they don't recognize the Pope's authority over their own school. There's obviously a lot less vitriol and a lot less historical conflict between the different schools of Buddhism as compared to Catholicism and Protestantism, but the fact remains that they do not recognize each other's leaders as their own. So this has been an introduction to some of the different schools of Buddhism that go on to develop in Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. We'll talk about more of the points of these individual schools in the future, but mainly I focus on Mahayana Buddhism because, like I've said before, this is the Buddhism for householders, for real people in the real world who have children, families, friends, enemies, debts, and grief and sadness and hunger and need and material possessions. And I feel like that's the most pertinent for the most people in this day and age, given that that's the real world that we live in. So I'll talk most about that, but I'll also talk a little bit about Theravada and Vajrayana as well. I hope that you've enjoyed this and learned something from this. If you have any suggestions for future videos, or if you have any questions or comments, please let me know in the comments and I'll discuss them with you. In the meantime, I wish you all the best health and happiness and joy during the coronavirus pandemic and beyond, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.